At 12 minutes past midnight on June 2nd, 2026, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake ruptured 150 miles below the southern coast of Italy, in a place where, according to the textbook understanding of how rock breaks, brittle failure should not be physically possible. Nobody died, nothing fell down, no tsunami was issued. The pager alert came up green within minutes. By the next morning, the news cycle had moved on, but on every broadband seismograph on the planet, from Petrolia, California to Alaska to Japan, a sharp, impulsive pulse arrived from beneath the Calabrian Arc, and it carried with it one of the oldest unsolved questions in solid Earth geophysics. How does rock break at a depth where the surrounding pressure should make brittle failure impossible? Tonight we're going to walk through exactly what happened, exactly why the depth makes it strange, and exactly what the three competing physical theories say is going on inside Italy's hidden slab. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The earthquake that shouldn't have happened. Just past midnight on June 2nd, 2026, the ground beneath southern Italy moved. Not the kind of motion you would feel as a sharp jolt under your feet. Not the kind of motion that brings down a building, or splits a road, or sends people running into the street. The kind of motion that a few hundred broadband seismographs scattered across every continent on the planet recorded at almost exactly the same instant, each one tracing the same pulse, arriving from below, travelling through the deep interior of the Earth at 6 kilometers per second. The pulse came from a point in space approximately 22 kilometers west, southwest of a small town called Scarcelli, on the Calabrian coast of the southern Tyrrhenian Sea. It came from 150 miles below that point. It registered as a magnitude 6.2 earthquake on the moment magnitude scale, after a brief upward revision from an initial estimate of 6.5 and a careful downward correction by the European Mediterranean Seismological Center and the United States Geological Survey, working from the same waveforms. And almost immediately, looking at the depth, almost everyone who understands what deep earthquakes are supposed to be looked at the report and asked the same question. How did this happen? Because the depth of this earthquake is the problem. 243 kilometers below the surface according to USGS, 250 according to EMSC, roughly 150 miles down. At that depth, inside the Earth, the rock should not have been able to do what it just did. The conventional, textbook, 100-year-old understanding of how earthquakes work says rock at that depth cannot store the kind of elastic strain that produces a sudden brittle rupture. The pressure crushing in on every surface from every direction is so enormous that any fault you might imagine sliding suddenly should instead be pinned shut, held in place by a force so large that no realistic amount of stored stress could overcome it. And yet a fault did slide. We know it slid because the energy released from that motion radiated outward through the mantle and was caught on the other side of the planet, a pulse so sharp and so clean that monitoring stations in Petrolia, California, in Alaska, in Japan, all picked it up within minutes of arrival, each one recording the same impulsive shape, the same telltale signature of a deep focus rupture, the same evidence that something at 150 miles below Italy, in defiance of what we think we know about rock mechanics, just broke. This is the story that lays itself on your desk on the 2nd of June 2026. Not a disaster story, not a tragedy story. Nobody died, nothing fell down. The pager alert from USGS came up green, meaning the model expects no fatalities and minimal economic damage. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center did not issue an advisory, because deep focus earthquakes do not displace water. The Italian National Institute of Geophysics, INGV, the agency in Rome that monitors every tremor across the entire peninsula and watches every volcano on the slab beneath it, recorded the event on every station within 500 kilometers of the epicenter and went into the data analysis phase the way they always do. From the surface, this earthquake essentially did not happen. From a satellite, you would have seen nothing. From a window in Catanzaro, you would have felt at most a soft brief swaying that you might have mistaken for fatigue. The conventional disaster apparatus that exists to respond to earthquakes had nothing to respond to. And that is exactly why this story matters. Because the disaster apparatus is not the only thing that an earthquake teaches us. An earthquake is also a signal sent out from a part of the Earth that we cannot otherwise see, a signal whose shape and timing and depth tell us about the mechanical state of regions of the planet that no instrument has ever directly visited. And the signal that came out of Calabria last night is one of the rarest kinds of signal that the Earth ever produces. It is the signal of a deep focus rupture, and it is the kind of signal that has been quietly haunting one of the oldest unsolved problems in geophysics for almost exactly 100 years. We are going to spend this video doing one thing. We are going to look at exactly what happened, exactly what the depth makes impossible, exactly what the three competing physical models say is happening anyway, exactly what we can rule out, exactly what we cannot rule out, and exactly why an earthquake that did no damage and triggered no warning is in fact one of the most interesting events we have seen all year. By the end, you will understand the mystery, you will understand the three candidate solutions, you will understand what it means that none of them has won, and you will understand why a magnitude 6.2 earthquake in a country where no one was hurt should still command your attention. Because the question this earthquake forces back onto the table is a question we have never closed. How does rock break at a depth where rock should not be able to break? The answer is still open. And Italy just gave us one more data point. A small additional thought before we move on, because the framing of the next 12 parts depends on it. There is a tendency, when we hear that an earthquake happened somewhere, and that it did not cause damage, and that no warning was issued, to mentally file it as a non-event. The damage frame is the frame we are most accustomed to, because damage is the only frame in which earthquakes regularly enter the news cycle. An earthquake that does not cause damage is not, in the conventional news sense, a story. But the news frame is not the only frame. There is also the scientific frame. There is the structural frame. There is the frame in which an earthquake is not primarily an event that affects buildings and people, but an event that tells us something about the structure of the planet we live on. From the scientific frame, the magnitude of the event matters less than its location and depth. A magnitude 6.2 from the Calabrian Arc at 243 kilometers is more scientifically interesting than a magnitude 6.5 from a typical shallow source on the San Andreas Fault, even though the San Andreas event would be vastly more newsworthy. The deep event is rarer. The deep event is harder to explain. The deep event carries information about a part of the planet we cannot otherwise see. The reason I'm laying this out is that the rest of this video is going to be in the scientific frame, not the damage frame. We are not going to talk about damage because there was none worth talking about. We are going to talk about what happened mechanically, why it is hard to explain, what the candidate explanations are, what we can rule out, what we cannot rule out, and why a small, distant, no-damage event from a quiet province in southern Italy is in fact one of the more interesting things that happened on the planet last week. If the scientific frame is not what you came for, that is fine. Most YouTube videos about earthquakes are damage frame and they serve a real purpose. But the scientific frame is what this earthquake actually offers, and that is what we're going to spend the next 2 hours unpacking. Part 2. 150 miles underground. Let us start with the depth, because the depth is the entire engine of what makes this story strange. 243 kilometers below the surface of the Earth, 151 miles. To get a feel for what that distance means, imagine driving from the Italian coast at Salerno straight down. Past the wine country, past the limestone bedrock, past the Apennine roots, past the Moho, the boundary between the crust and the upper mantle, which in this part of Italy sits at about 30 kilometers. Keep going, past 60 kilometers, past 90, past 120. You are now well into the upper mantle, in the region of the Earth that is solid but plastic, that flows over geologic timescales of millions of years, while behaving like a brittle solid over the seconds to minutes timescales of seismic waves. Keep going, past 150 kilometers, past 180, past 210. The temperature around you is now somewhere between 1300 and 1500 degrees Celsius. The pressure has climbed to roughly 7.5 gigapascals, about 70,000 atmospheres, or 70,000 times the air pressure you experienced when you stepped outside this morning. Keep going, 243 kilometers. Stop. That is where the rupture occurred. That is where the rock moved. At that depth, you are not in the crust anymore. You're not even in the part of the mantle that any drilling project has ever come close to reaching. You're nearly 1/4 of the way to the boundary of the mantle and the outer core, at a depth where the entire weight of every cubic centimetre of rock above you is pressing down on every cubic centimetre of rock around you, in every direction at once, with a force equivalent to having about 750,000 kilograms balanced on top of every square centimetre of any imaginary surface you might draw. The mineral that dominates this region of the Earth is olivine, the green gemstone you might know as peridot, the same mineral that makes up the bulk of all oceanic mantle. At 7 gigapascals and a few hundred degrees of cold slab temperature, olivine is not soft. It is not molten. It is solid rock, with its atoms locked into a crystal lattice that the surrounding pressure makes impossible for any individual atom to easily move out of. Under those conditions, the most basic principle of how brittle materials break, the principle that has underwritten every introductory geology textbook for almost 2 centuries, says that you cannot have a sudden rupture. Brittle failure requires that stored elastic energy be released at a speed that exceeds the rate at which the rock can flow plastically. At depths greater than a few tens of kilometres, the temperature in the surrounding mantle rises high enough that rock starts to creep, to deform slowly, smoothly, viscously, like silly putty over very long time scales. As temperature rises, the rate at which the rock can creep rises too, and once the creep rate is fast enough, any stress you apply gets dissipated as smooth, viscous flow before it can build up to the level where a fault can rip. This is why earthquakes are supposed to be a shallow phenomenon. This is why almost every earthquake you have ever heard of is less than 30 or 40 kilometers deep. The crust is cold and brittle. The upper mantle is warm and plastic. Brittle failure happens where the rock is cold. Plastic flow happens where the rock is warm. There is a transition zone, and below that transition zone, brittle rupture should simply stop. That is the model. But there is a complication. The rock at 243 kilometers below Italy is not the mantle rock that has been sitting there for billions of years. It is the rock of a subducting oceanic plate, and subducting plates carry the temperature of their surface conditions down with them. The Ionian plate, a piece of the African plate that started its descent into the mantle beneath southern Italy tens of millions of years ago, was once at the ocean floor at temperatures of around 4 degrees Celsius. As it sinks, it heats up, slowly, by conduction from the surrounding hotter mantle. But the conduction is slow. The interior of a subducting slab can stay several hundred degrees cooler than the surrounding mantle for the entire length of its descent, all the way down to the 700-kilometer phase boundary where the upper mantle ends. The Calabrian slab is small, but it is steep and cold. At 243 kilometers depth, the interior of the descending Ionian slab is estimated to be somewhere between 400 and 600 degrees Celsius cooler than the asthenosphere that surrounds it. That cooler temperature is what makes brittle-like failure possible at all. It is the only reason a rupture at this depth is even conceivable. But here is the catch. Even with that several hundred-degree thermal anomaly, the rock inside the slab at 243 kilometers is still under 7 gigapascals of confining pressure. The clamp from every direction is still enormous. The Coulomb friction model, the equation that geologists and engineers use to predict when a fault will slip, says the maximum stress that a fault can support without slipping is proportional to the normal stress pressing the two sides together. At 7 gigapascals, the normal stress is so high that the frictional resistance to slip on any imaginable fault inside the slab should exceed the elastic stress available to drive the slip. Even in the cold interior of the slab, even with the 400-degree thermal anomaly, the numbers taken at face value say brittle rupture should not occur. And yet rupture did occur. A magnitude 6.2 release, approximately 6.3 times 10 to the 13th joules of seismic energy, which is the equivalent of roughly 15 kilotons of TNT, which is roughly the yield of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. All of it released in a few seconds from a point of rock the size of perhaps several square kilometers, 243 kilometers below the Calabrian coast. That energy radiated outward in all directions as elastic waves, the same kind of waves that carry every other earthquake's energy, and those waves travelled up through the mantle, through the asthenosphere, through the crust, until they emerged at the surface and were detected by every broadband seismograph on the planet. The signal that arrived at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Station at Petrolia on the northern California coast was a pulse. A clean, sharp, impulsive pulse, slightly delayed by the travel time through the Earth, but unmistakably a real earthquake, recorded by a real instrument, originating from a real volume of rock at a real depth, where the textbook says it should not have happened. So either the textbook is wrong, or there is something happening inside the slab that the textbook does not describe. The answer, as we will see, is some combination of both. There is a way of thinking about confining pressure that I find useful because it gets at the specific reason brittle failure becomes impossible at depth, and I want to share it with you before we move on, because the rest of this video depends on you really feeling the force of the contradiction. Imagine you have a long, thin stick of brittle material, say a piece of chalk. You hold the chalk at the surface, you bend it, it snaps. The snap is brittle failure, and it happens because the tensile stress on the bottom edge of the chalk, where the bending is stretching the material apart, exceeds the chalk's tensile strength. Nothing exotic. The material breaks. Now imagine you take the same piece of chalk and you put it inside a chamber. You fill the chamber with water and pressurize it to 100 atmospheres. Now you try to bend the chalk. You apply the same bending force as before. The chalk does not break. The pressurized water is pushing in on the chalk from every direction, including pushing against the edge that the bending wants to stretch apart. The tensile stress that the bending creates is partially cancelled by the compressive stress that the pressurized water provides. To break the chalk, you now have to bend it much harder, hard enough to overcome both the chalk's tensile strength and the additional resistance from the water pressure. Now imagine you raise the pressure to 1,000 atmospheres, now 10,000, now 70,000. Each time the bending force required to break the chalk goes up, because the confining pressure is pressing the would-be fracture surface together harder and harder. At some point, the bending force required exceeds anything you can physically apply, and the chalk simply will not break. Instead, if you try to deform it further, it will deform plastically. It will flow, slowly, like very thick taffy, accommodating whatever shape the bending forces want to impose on it without ever fracturing. That, in a simplified picture, is what happens to rock at 243 kilometers depth. The confining pressure is 70,000 atmospheres. The clamp from every direction is so enormous that any tensile or shear stress that might want to rip a fault apart is cancelled by the compression. The textbook says rock under those conditions cannot break brittly. It can only flow. And yet, on the night of June 1st, somewhere inside the descending Ionian slab, rock did break. The pulse arrived at every seismograph on the planet. The energy release was unmistakable. The textbook is, at minimum, incomplete. One thing worth noting before we move on. The cold slab thermal anomaly that I mentioned earlier is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Cold slabs exist beneath many places where deep earthquakes do not occur. The Cocos Plate beneath Mexico, for example, has a cold slab descending to substantial depths, but it produces relatively few intermediate depth events. The relationship between slab age, slab temperature, slab geometry, and deep seismicity is complicated, and it has been the subject of decades of research without producing a clean predictive relationship. Some cold slabs are seismically active deep down. Some cold slabs are seismically quiet deep down. The factors that determine the difference are still not fully understood. The Calabrian slab, fortunately for this story, is in the active category. It produces deep events, on rare occasions, at exactly the magnitude class we saw on June 1st. Part 3. The pulse that reached Petrolia, Alaska, and Japan. There is a particular signature that deep focus earthquakes leave on the global seismic record, and it is worth pausing on because that signature is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have that the Italy event of June 1st really was what the depth says it was. When a shallow earthquake occurs, say a magnitude 6 event with a focus at 15 kilometers, the energy that escapes from the rupture takes many different paths to reach distant seismographs. Some of it travels as body waves through the deep earth. Some of it travels as surface waves along the boundary between the crust and the air, hugging the curvature of the planet. Some of it gets reflected, refracted, scattered. By the time the wave train arrives at a station thousands of miles away, it has become a complicated mess. The body wave arrives first, but its arrival is smeared and softened by all the conversions and interactions along the way. The surface waves arrive much later, often minutes later, and they carry a long, drawn-out, slow oscillation that lasts for several minutes. Shallow earthquakes look complicated on a seismogram. Deep focus earthquakes do not. When the rupture occurs at 243 kilometers, the energy that escapes has essentially only one path. It cannot travel along the surface. because there is no surface where it begins. It has to travel up through the mantle to reach any observer. So what you get at a station on the other side of the world is a clean, impulsive body wave arrival with very little surface wave contamination and a much sharper signal than a shallow event of the same magnitude would produce. Seismologists call this teleseismic detectability, and deep focus earthquakes are famous for being unusually clean on the world seismic network. They radiate their energy into the mantle, as if the mantle were a transparent medium, and they emerge on the other side as a pulse. A pulse, not a wave train. That is exactly what was recorded after the Italian rupture. The seismographs in Petrolia, in Alaska, in Japan, 3 stations roughly antipodal or otherwise oriented around the globe relative to the Italian source, each recorded an unusually sharp, unusually impulsive primary wave arrival at roughly the time you would predict if you took the standard global travel timetables and plugged in 243 kilometers of source depth and the great circle distance from Calabria to each station. The signal was clean. The signal was global. The signal was a pulse. There was no ambiguity about whether something deep had ruptured. The signature of the depth was written directly into the shape of the wave. I want to pause here and address something, because I have already seen some commentary online suggesting that the fact that seismographs across the planet picked this earthquake up is somehow unusual or suspicious, or evidence that something larger is brewing. It is not. Every earthquake of magnitude 6 or greater, anywhere on Earth, is recorded on every single operational broadband seismograph on the planet. That is the baseline expectation of modern seismology. The global seismic network exists for the explicit purpose of recording every event above this magnitude threshold. The Italian rupture being recorded in Petrolia is not the anomaly. It is the norm. What is slightly distinctive, and worth noticing, is the impulsiveness of the recorded signal, which is the signature of a deep source, not the signature of a coordinated global cascade. If you saw a video where someone pointed at the seismographs lighting up and suggested that something planet-wide was happening, what they were actually pointing at is exactly what a textbook deep focus event is supposed to look like on the world network. The textbook predicts the impulsive arrival. The textbook predicts the global detection. What the textbook does not predict, what the textbook still cannot explain, is why the rupture occurred at all. The detection is mundane, the rupture is the mystery. There is one more useful piece of information embedded in those global pulse arrivals. The shape of the pulse, when you do a careful Fourier analysis of it, tells you something about the corner frequency of the source, essentially how quickly the rupture grew and how compact it was in time. Many deep focus earthquakes have unusually high stress drops compared to shallow events of the same moment magnitude, which means the rupture released more energy per unit area than the average shallow earthquake. We do not yet have a definitive corner frequency analysis for the June 1st event. That will take a few weeks for the moment tensor groups at Harvard and at USGS NERC to fully process. But the preliminary impressions, based on the impulsive pulse shape recorded at the high-quality global stations, are consistent with the typical deep focus signature. This rupture, like most events of its kind, probably released its energy unusually efficiently, in a more concentrated burst than the same moment magnitude shallow event would produce. That tells us something subtle about the mechanism. Whatever drove the rupture, it was a fast, sharp, high-stress drop process, not a slow plastic creep, not a gradual viscous adjustment, a sudden, energetic, brittle-like event with a sharp leading edge at a depth where the conventional understanding says sharp leading edges should not be possible. I want to spend another moment on what the global seismograph network actually does, because this is the kind of background that almost nobody who is not a working seismologist ever gets exposed to, and it makes the story of the Italian rupture richer when you understand the infrastructure that detected it. Around the world, there are a few hundred broadband seismic stations that are part of what is sometimes called the Global Seismic Network, or GSN, or various coordinated programs operated by IRIS, by the United States Geological Survey, by national geological surveys around the world, and by academic consortia. Each station consists of a sensor, typically a feedback-controlled pendulum or a similar instrument capable of recording ground motion across a very wide range of frequencies, buried in a vault or in a borehole at a quiet location, far from highways and cities and other sources of mechanical noise. The sensors are calibrated to record ground motion velocities from about 1,000th of a hertz up to about 100 Hz, which is the entire range of frequencies relevant to global seismology. When an earthquake occurs anywhere on Earth, every station with a clear path to the source records the arriving waves. The big stations like the one at Petrolia, or the IRIS station in Alaska, or the Japanese FNet stations stream their data essentially continuously over the internet to data centers in Seattle, in Albuquerque, in Tokyo, in Bristol. The data centers automatically detect arriving waves, automatically associate them with potential source locations, and automatically generate provisional magnitude and location estimates within minutes of the event. The provisional estimates get refined within an hour or two as human analysts review the waveforms. By 6 to 12 hours after a notable event, the moment tensor groups at Harvard, at USGS NIC, at GeoPhon, at GFZ Potsdam have produced their preliminary moment tensor solutions and their preliminary source characterizations. By 24 hours, the consensus magnitude and depth are usually firm. By a week, the source mechanism inversions and the corner frequency analyses are complete. By a month, the event is fully characterized and ready for citation in the scientific literature. The Italian event of June first went through this exact pipeline, accelerated by the relatively simple geometry of a deep focus rupture and the very high signal-to-noise ratio on most of the global stations. Within minutes, the provisional location was at the Calabrian Arc. Within 30 minutes, the depth had been narrowed to somewhere between 200 and 250 kilometers. Within an hour, the magnitude had settled at 6.2. The Mediterranean stations, particularly the NGV stations in Italy, contributed the highest resolution data because of their proximity. But the far-field stations, Petrolia, Alaska, Japan, contributed essential constraints on the deep focus character of the event because of the impulsive nature of the body wave arrivals at large distance. The reason I want you to know all of this is that the global seismic network is one of the great quiet successes of modern Earth science. It runs without much fanfare. It detects every meaningful event on the planet in close to real time, with sub-kilometer location accuracy in most regions and sub-10th magnitude precision. The data is mostly open. Anybody with an internet connection and a basic understanding of seismology can access the waveforms from any of these stations, look at the recordings of the Italian event, see the impulsive pulse with their own eyes. When you hear someone claim that something seismic was suppressed, or that the data was manipulated, or that an event was larger or smaller than reported, the answer is to look at the data yourself. It is there. It is open. The network is working. The pulse from Italy was detected. It was characterized. The depth was determined. The magnitude was finalized. The mechanism was inverted. All of this happened in the standard, transparent, peer-reviewable workflow that has defined modern seismology for the past 40 years. The only thing that the workflow cannot give us, even at this level of operational maturity, is the physical mechanism inside the slab that produced the rupture. That is still an open question. But the existence of the rupture, its location, its size, its time, are all matters of public record, available to anybody who cares to look. Part 4. The Calabrian Arc, Italy's hidden slab. To understand why this earthquake happened where it happened, you need to understand a piece of geology that almost nobody outside Italy ever thinks about, even though it is one of the most active and dynamically interesting subduction systems on the planet. It is called the Calabrian Arc. It is the reason Etna is the largest active volcano in Europe. It is the reason Stromboli has been erupting continuously for thousands of years. It is the reason Vulcano gives its name to every other volcano in every other language. It is the reason the Tyrrhenian Sea exists as a young, hot, volcanic ocean basin tucked between Italy and Sardinia and northern Sicily. It is the reason that the southern tip of Italy is shaped the way it is, curving like a hook around the Calabrian Peninsula, with the toe of the Italian boot reaching across the Strait of Messina towards Sicily. The Calabrian Arc is the surface expression of a subduction zone, and the subduction zone is the engine that has shaped this entire region of the Mediterranean for the past 20 million years. Here is what is happening down there. The African plate, which carries the African continent, is converging with the Eurasian plate, which carries Europe. The two plates are coming together at a rate of about 0.5 centimetre to 2.5 centimetres per year, depending on where exactly you measure. This is slow as plate tectonics goes. The Pacific subducts beneath South America at 6 to 8 centimetres per year. The Pacific subducts beneath Japan at 9 centimeters per year. The convergence between Africa and Europe is among the slowest convergence rates anywhere in the world. But it has been going on for tens of millions of years, and over that span of time, even a slow rate adds up to a lot of crust consumed. In most of the Mediterranean, the African plate and the Eurasian plate meet in a complicated patchwork of small microplates and slow-moving fragments. But in one specific spot beneath the southern Tyrrhenian Sea, the convergence is concentrated into a narrow, steeply dipping, very fast-moving subduction zone. A piece of the African plate, a sliver of old Ionian sea floor formed in the Mesozoic, more than 150 million years old, has been pulled down into the mantle along a roughly southeast dipping plane. This is the Ionian Slab. It is a narrow finger of cold oceanic lithosphere, perhaps 200 kilometers wide, descending at a steep angle of 70 to 80 degrees beneath southern Italy. It has been traced through the mantle, using seismic tomography, all the way down to a depth of approximately 700 kilometers, which is the boundary of the upper mantle and the transition zone. Below that depth, the slab effectively ends. It either flattens out and dissipates, or it is rapidly being absorbed into the more uniformly dense lower mantle. The Calabrian Arc is not a static subduction zone. It is in active rollback. What that means is that the trench, the line on the seafloor where the African plate disappears beneath the Eurasian plate, is itself migrating backward, away from the volcanic arc toward the southeast. The slab is pulling itself down under its own weight faster than the African plate is converging toward Europe, so the hinge of the slab is rolling backward through the mantle, and as it does, the upper plate is being stretched and torn behind it. The Tyrrhenian back arc basin, the body of water between Italy and Sardinia, is what fills the void as the upper plate stretches. The Tyrrhenian Sea is, geologically, a brand new ocean basin, only a few million years old, formed by the extension of the upper plate as the Ionian slab rolled back and pulled it apart. All of this is relevant because the Ionian slab is the source of essentially everything dramatic that happens in this part of Italy. The slab descends, the slab dehydrates. Water released from the slab as it heats up rises into the overlying mantle wedge. The water lowers the melting point of the mantle partially melts. The partial melt rises through the crust and erupts. Etna is the largest expression of this. Stromboli is a smaller expression of this. Vulcano is a smaller expression of this. The Aeolian Islands, the chain that stretches from Stromboli to Vulcano to Lipari, all sit above the slab and all derive their volcanic activity from it. 2 weeks ago on PNW, we covered the question of whether something is going wrong with Etna, whether its eruptive behaviour in 2026 was showing signs of a system reorganisation rather than ordinary background activity. The piece focused on the tearing of the Ionian slab and the possibility that the slab is undergoing a structural change that is being expressed at the surface through the volcanism. The earthquake on June 1st is, in a sense, the same story from the other side. The slab that we examined from the surface, looking down through the volcanic chimney, just rang from the inside. A rupture at 243 kilometers depth is the slab itself shifting. We saw the smoke before, now we are seeing the engine. The connection matters for 2 reasons. First, it tells us that we are looking at one coherent geophysical object. The slab, the deep earthquake, the volcanism, the back arc basin, all of it is part of one descending object that is mechanically active across hundreds of kilometers of depth. Second, it tells us that the depth of the rupture is not random. The Ionian slab, traced in seismic tomography, shows a continuous Wadati-Benioff zone of seismicity from the trench down to about 600 kilometers depth. The 243-kilometer rupture sits squarely inside that zone. This was not a random failure in random rock. This was an event inside an object whose 3-dimensional structure we already know. The Italian rupture happened in the place where the model says deep slab earthquakes should be capable of happening. The question is not where, the question is how. A small additional piece of context about the Ionian slab. It is, by global standards, an unusual subduction zone. Most of the world's great subducting slabs, the Pacific descending beneath Japan, the Pacific descending beneath the Kurils, the Cocos descending beneath Central America, the Nazca descending beneath South America, a large, wide, and relatively young oceanic lithosphere. They are tens of millions of years old, hundreds to a few thousand kilometers wide, and they descend at angles between 30 and 60 degrees generally. They are the textbook subducting slabs. The Ionian slab is different. It is old. Pieces of Mesozoic oceanic lithosphere that may date back 150 million years or more. It is narrow, perhaps 200 kilometers wide. It is very steep, descending at angles approaching 80 degrees in its deeper portions, and it has been actively rolling back through the mantle for at least the past 20 million years, faster than the African plate has been converging with Eurasia, which means the slab is sinking under its own weight more rapidly than it is being fed from the surface. The trench has retreated southeastward by several hundred kilometers during that span. The Calabrian Arc has migrated southeastward with it. The Tyrrhenian back arc basin has opened in the wake of the retreat. All of these characteristics, old, narrow, steep, rolling back, combine to make the Ionian slab one of the colder, denser, more mechanically active small slabs on Earth. The cold density gradient drives the slab pull. The slab pull drives the rollback. The rollback opens the back arc basin. The opening produces the volcanism, and inside the cold descending lithosphere itself, the conditions are right, at least occasionally, for the kind of deep focus rupture that occurred on June 1st. If you wanted to design a slab that would, every century or so, produce a rare but globally detectable deep focus event, you might design something not very different from the Ionian slab. The Calabrian Arc is not famous in the way that Sumatra is famous, or Tohoku, or Cascadia, because the magnitudes it produces are smaller and the human exposure is lower. But as a piece of slab dynamics, as a chunk of Earth machinery, it is one of the more interesting subduction systems on the planet. Its deep events, when they come, are worth paying attention to because they are some of the cleanest test cases for the deep focus problem that the world ever produces. Part 5. The Wadati-Benioff Zone and the Century-Old Mystery. In the early 1920s, a Japanese seismologist named Kiyu Wadati began collecting earthquake records from the network of observatories that had been built up across Japan in the previous several decades. He noticed something that nobody had quite noticed before. When he plotted the foci of Japanese earthquakes, the underground points where each rupture had originated, and looked at how their depths varied across the country, he saw a pattern. The shallow earthquakes were concentrated along the coast of the Pacific. As you moved inland, the earthquakes got deeper. The deepest earthquakes, the ones that came from hundreds of kilometers down, were found beneath the Sea of Japan, far from any coast. Wadati had effectively mapped the descending slab beneath Japan, decades before plate tectonics had been formalized as a theory. The line of seismicity ran from the surface of the Pacific Trench, downward and westward, in a dipping plane that reached 600 kilometers below the western edge of the Japanese archipelago. Then, in 1949, an American seismologist named Hugo Benioff at Caltech generalized the observation. Working with much larger global datasets and substantially better instrumentation, Benioff showed that the same dipping plane of seismicity existed beneath every major trench and arc system on Earth. The Aleutians, Japan, the Marianas, Tonga, the Andes. Wherever there was a deep oceanic trench, there was a corresponding inclined zone of deep seismicity rising up from it, reaching back into the mantle at angles between 30 and 90 degrees, with earthquakes scattered along the entire length of the zone, from the surface down to the maximum depth of 700 kilometers. Benioff published the synthesis in the GSA Bulletin in 1949, and the inclined zone became known, in his honor and Wadati's, as the Wadati-Benioff zone. The discovery of the Wadati-Benioff zone was one of the most important early pieces of evidence for the existence of subduction. Plate tectonics, as a coherent theory, was still about 15 to 20 years from being assembled. But Benioff and Wadati had already shown, through pure observation, that something was descending into the mantle beneath every trench, and that this something was generating earthquakes as it went. Geologists had to figure out what the something was and why it was descending. That took the additional work of Harry Hess and Robert Dietz and others in the late 1950s and early 60s, but the descending slabs themselves had been visible in the earthquake catalogue since the 1920s. Here is the part that has been quietly haunting geophysics ever since. From the moment Wadati and Benioff identified the deep portions of these zones, the central problem was obvious. How are earthquakes happening at depths of 200, 300, 400, even 600 kilometers? At those depths, every relevant calculation says brittle failure should be impossible. The conventional Coulomb friction model, the one that Charles-Augustin de Coulomb himself originated in 1773, says that frictional resistance on a fault is proportional to the normal stress pressing the two sides together. At hundreds of kilometers depth, that normal stress is enormous. Anything that might slide on a fault should be held in place by the surrounding pressure. The fact that the deep earthquakes existed at all, clearly visible in the data, indisputably real, was a direct contradiction of the textbook understanding. Either the textbook was wrong, or there was something happening at depth that the textbook did not describe. For the next several decades, the question went largely unresolved. The Wadati-Benioff zone was a phenomenological fact. The deep earthquakes were catalogued, measured, located, characterized. Their patterns were studied. Cliff Froelich, working at the University of Texas at Austin, spent decades collecting and analyzing every known deep focus event. His book, Deep Earthquakes, published in 2006 by Cambridge University Press, remains the standard reference on the topic. Froelich documented dozens of features of deep earthquakes that distinguish them from shallow ones: their high stress drops, their lack of foreshocks, their unusual aftershock patterns, their tendency to cluster in specific depth ranges within each slab. But the underlying physical mechanism remained, and to a large extent still remains, an open question. 3 candidate physical models emerged over the late 20th century to try to explain how deep focus earthquakes can happen at all. We are going to take each one in turn, because the Italian rupture on June 1st probably involves some combination of all 3, and you cannot evaluate what may have happened without knowing what is on the menu. But before we move to the candidate mechanisms, I want to pause and emphasize the point. The deep focus seismology problem is not a small problem. It is not a footnote. It is one of the major unresolved questions in solid Earth geophysics. We have known about it for 100 years. We have run laboratory experiments at relevant pressures and temperatures. We have collected enormous datasets. We have built sophisticated theoretical models, and we still cannot say with confidence which mechanism is responsible for any particular deep earthquake, including the one that happened beneath Italy on June 1, 2026. The earthquake itself is a data point. The puzzle remains open. I want to spend a moment on Hugo Benioff himself, because the story of how the deep focus problem came into focus is, in its own way, a small window into how science actually progresses. Benioff was a Caltech seismologist who, in addition to his work on the inclined seismic zones, designed and built many of the most influential seismographs of the mid-20th century. His instruments, particularly the Benioff vertical component seismograph, became standard equipment at observatories around the world in the 1930s and 40s. The data those instruments collected became the empirical foundation for plate tectonics. Benioff personally was not a theorist of plate motion. He was an instrumentalist and an observer. He built the tools that let other people see what he had seen. When Benioff and Wadati mapped the inclined zones, they did so without any preconception of subduction. There was no theory in 1949 that said cold lithosphere should be descending into the mantle. The continental drift hypothesis, proposed by Alfred Wegener in 1912, was still controversial. Most geologists in the United States rejected it through the 1950s. The mechanism by which continents could move was unknown. The discovery of seafloor spreading by Harry Hess and Robert Dietz was still a decade away. The synthesis of plate tectonics by Tuzo Wilson, by Dan Mackenzie, by Jason Morgan was 20 years away. Benioff and Wadati had no framework into which to fit the inclined zones. They had only the observation. What they did with the observation is, I think, one of the most admirable things in the history of geophysics. They published it. They named it. They documented it carefully. They did not try to fit it into a theory that did not yet exist. They simply put the data on the table and waited for the theory to catch up. When plate tectonics arrived 15 years later, the inclined zones were already there, waiting to be interpreted. They became one of the first and most decisive pieces of evidence for subduction. The descending slabs that plate tectonics required were already visible in the earthquake catalogue, mapped by Benioff and Wadati before anybody knew what they were looking at. The lesson, for our purposes, is that the deep focus problem itself has been visible for almost as long as the inclined zones have been mapped. The earthquakes happen, the depths are real. The pressures and temperatures at those depths make brittle failure look impossible. The contradiction has been on the table since the 1920s, in the same way that the inclined zones themselves were on the table. The contradiction is by now almost old. It is older than the modern theory of plate tectonics. It is older than the moon landings. It is older than computers, older than commercial aviation, older than penicillin. The question of how rock breaks at deep focus depths is one of the durably open questions of solid Earth geophysics. The Italy event of June 1st is one more nudge against it. Part 6. Why rock shouldn't break at this depth. Let me be very specific about what the conventional understanding actually says, because if you really want to feel the strangeness of a deep focus earthquake, you have to feel the strangeness of the rule it appears to be breaking. Rock, at any depth and any temperature, can deform in two fundamentally different ways. The first is called brittle deformation. In brittle deformation, the rock holds its shape under stress until the stress exceeds some threshold, and then it fails suddenly along a discrete fracture surface. The release of stored elastic energy at that moment of failure is what we feel as an earthquake. Brittle failure is the kind of deformation you see in any rock you might smash with a hammer at the surface. The rock holds for a moment, then it shatters. The second is called ductile, or plastic deformation. In ductile deformation, the rock flows. It does not fracture. Instead, it continuously rearranges its internal atomic structure to accommodate the applied stress, smoothly and without any sudden release. Ductile deformation is what happens when you imagine a piece of toffee being slowly stretched, or when you imagine ice flowing in a glacier. The material changes shape, but it does so smoothly, viscously, without sudden ruptures. Whether a given chunk of rock will deform brittly or ductilely depends on three factors. The first is the temperature of the rock. Higher temperature favours ductile flow because higher temperature gives more thermal energy to the atoms in the crystal lattice, allowing them to slip past each other more easily. The second is the rate at which the stress is being applied. Faster rates favour brittle failure because the rock does not have time to flow smoothly. Slower rates favour ductile flow because the rock has all the time it needs to creep. The third is the confining pressure, the pressure squeezing the rock from all sides at once. Confining pressure suppresses brittle failure because it clamps the rock together so tightly that any imaginary fault surface cannot slip without overcoming the friction caused by the clamping force. Now apply this to 243 kilometers of depth. The pressure is about 7.5 gigapascals, roughly 70,000 atmospheres. That is an enormous confining stress, vastly larger than anything you would ever encounter at the surface, even if the temperature inside the slab is several hundred degrees cooler than the surrounding mantle, say 400 or 500 degrees Celsius instead of the surrounding 12 or 1300. The temperature is still high enough that olivine and the other mantle minerals can creep very slowly on geologic timescales. The combination of high confining pressure and warm enough to creep temperature is the textbook recipe for ductile deformation. Brittle failure in this picture should be physically prevented. There should be no fault that can slip. There should be no earthquake at all. And yet the data is unambiguous. Earthquakes occur at depths greater than 200 kilometers. They have a moment magnitude scale, just like shallow earthquakes. They radiate energy as elastic waves. They are detected on broadband seismic networks. The largest recorded deep focus earthquake, the 1994 Bolivia event at 637 kilometers depth, reached a moment magnitude of 8.2. That is more than 100 times more energetic than the Italian event of June 1st. The Bolivian rupture released roughly 10 to the 18th joules, a planet-relevant amount of energy, from a focus more than a third of the way through the upper mantle. The data is real, the deep earthquakes are real, the numbers do not lie. So something is happening at depth that the conventional brittle failure framework does not capture. There are essentially three possibilities. Possibility 1. The conventional framework is wrong about how confining pressure interacts with rock at these conditions, and there is some special mechanism, operating only inside cold subducting slabs, that allows brittle-like behavior to persist deep into the mantle. Possibility 2. The brittle-like radiation patterns of deep earthquakes are an illusion, and what is actually happening at depth is a non-brittle mechanism that produces seismic radiation indistinguishable from brittle failure. Possibility 3. Some combination of the first two, in which different mechanisms operate at different depths or in different slabs, and the apparent unity of deep earthquakes is really a family of related but distinct phenomena. Modern deep focus seismology, as of 2026, has effectively concluded that the third possibility is the right one. The question is not what is the mechanism. The question is what specific mechanism operated in this specific slab at this specific event. The answers vary, and they vary in interesting ways. The Italian rupture is one more chance to ask the question. A practical note that I think is useful before we move on. When you read the seismological literature on deep focus earthquakes, you will encounter a recurring observation that the high-magnitude deep events tend to have unusually high stress drops compared to shallow events of the same moment magnitude. Stress drop is, roughly, the average reduction in shear stress on the fault surface during the rupture. For a typical shallow crustal earthquake, the stress drop is on the order of 1 to 10 megapascals. For deep focus events, the stress drop is often higher, sometimes much higher, with values of 50 or 100 megapascals not unusual. Why? Because the deeper rocks are under much higher confining pressure, and any rupture that does occur has to release a much larger pre-existing shear stress to overcome the lithostatic clamp. The cold slab interior, while still under enormous confining pressure, can store enormous shear stress between the moments when ruptures occur. When a rupture finally does occur, whatever the specific mechanism, the release stress is large because the stored stress was large. The deep focus events are, in this sense, energetically denser than shallow events. The same moment magnitude releases the same total seismic energy, but it does so from a smaller spatial volume with a higher stress drop, producing the characteristically impulsive teleseismic signatures we discussed in Part 3. The Italian event of June 1st will, when its corner frequency analysis is complete, almost certainly show a high stress drop consistent with the general pattern. That high stress drop is itself a clue about the mechanism. Phase transformation faulting, dehydration embrittlement, and thermal runaway all predict high stress drops for slightly different reasons, but they all predict them. The signature will tell us, in some subtle way, which mechanism may have dominated. We will not know the answer for several months, but the analysis is underway. Part 7. Mechanism 1. Metastable olivine and phase change earthquakes. In 1989, two materials scientists at the University of California, Davis published a paper in Nature that has become one of the most cited pieces of work in deep focus seismology. Their names were Harry Green and Pamela Burnley. They had spent years running high-pressure experiments on olivine, the mineral that dominates oceanic mantle and therefore dominates subducting slabs, and they had discovered something that, at the time, was quite surprising. Olivine, at the pressures of the upper mantle, is a stable mineral. It has a specific crystal structure, and it is the most thermodynamically stable form of magnesium iron silicate at the temperatures and pressures of the shallow mantle. But as you increase pressure further, olivine becomes unstable. At a pressure corresponding to about 410 kilometers depth in the Earth, olivine transforms into a denser polymorph called wadsleyite. At about 520 kilometers, wadsleyite transforms into an even denser polymorph called ringwoodite. At about 660 kilometers, ringwoodite transforms into a mixture of bridgmanite and ferropericlase, and you have left the upper mantle and entered the lower mantle. These phase changes are real and observable. They are responsible for the seismic discontinuities at 410 and 660 kilometers depth that have been seen in global seismic data for decades. They mark the boundaries of the upper mantle. In a warm mantle, the transformations happen efficiently. Olivine sinks past 410 kilometers, transforms to wadsleyite, sinks past 520 kilometers, transforms to ringwoodite, and so on. But in a cold subducting slab, something different happens. The transformations are not just thermodynamically driven, they are also kinetically driven. The rate at which olivine actually transforms into wadsleyite at a given temperature and pressure depends on how fast the atoms in the lattice can rearrange themselves into the new structure. At low temperature, the atoms move slowly. The transformation, even though it is thermodynamically favourable, can be kinetically delayed. The cold interior of a subducting slab can carry olivine in a thermodynamically unstable but kinetically frozen state. Past the 410 kilometer depth, past 500 kilometers, even down towards 600 kilometers. The olivine is metastable. It should have transformed already, but because the rock is too cold, the transformation has not had time to occur. Now here is Green and Burnley's insight. When metastable olivine eventually does transform, which it must, at some depth, because the kinetic delay cannot persist forever, the transformation is not gradual, it is sudden, and it does not happen uniformly throughout the slab. It happens along narrow zones, where some local perturbation triggers the first transformation, and then the latent heat released by that transformation raises the local temperature, which accelerates further transformation in the adjacent rock, which releases more heat, which propagates the transformation faster and further. The result is a self-organizing, narrow, fault-like band of transforming olivine that propagates through the slab at a speed that turns out to be comparable to a seismic rupture velocity. From the outside, what you see is something that looks exactly like a brittle earthquake. There is a sudden release of elastic energy. There is a sharp rupture front propagating through the rock. There is the radiation of seismic waves, but the underlying mechanism is not brittle fracture. It is a phase change cascade, the transformation faulting model. Green and Burnley reproduced this behavior in the laboratory at appropriate pressures and temperatures. They used olivine analogues, minerals that undergo similar phase changes at lower, more accessible pressures, and showed that when metastable olivine analogues are forced to transform under stress, they do so explosively, along narrow zones, releasing seismic-like energy. The mechanism in the laboratory works. The transformation faulting model has two great strengths and one significant weakness. The strengths first. First, it explains why deep focus earthquakes occur in subducting slabs and almost nowhere else. The reason is that you need metastable olivine to begin with, and metastable olivine requires a cold environment, and the only cold environments inside the deep mantle are subducting slabs. Second, it explains why deep focus earthquakes essentially stop at depths greater than 700 kilometers. Below that depth, even metastable olivine cannot persist. The temperature and pressure conditions force the transformation to completion regardless of the kinetics. So if transformation faulting is the mechanism, you expect a sharp lower limit at about 700 kilometers, and that is exactly what we observe. The weakness is the depth distribution within the slab. Many deep focus earthquakes, including, very possibly the Italian event of June 1st, occur at depths well above the 410-kilometer transition, where there is no plausible mechanism for olivine to be metastable. The Italian event was at 243 kilometers. At that depth, ordinary olivine is the thermodynamically stable form. There is no phase transformation expected. The metastable olivine mechanism, taken at face value, does not work for the shallower portion of the deep focus zone. The standard response of the transformation faulting community is that, although olivine itself is stable at 200 kilometers, the slab carries other minerals that may undergo their own kinetically delayed transformations at shallower depths. Hydrous minerals like antigorite serpentinite have their own phase relations and their own metastable states. Anhydrous minerals like enstatite can transform to other polymorphs under stress. The general principle that kinetically delayed phase changes drive sudden seismic-like ruptures inside cold slabs may apply across a range of depths, even if olivine specifically is not the relevant mineral at any particular event. But this is harder to test, the laboratory experiments are harder to design, and the depth distribution remains a real problem for the model. For the Italian rupture, the transformation faulting model offers a partial answer. The Ionian slab is small and cold. Inside it, somewhere, some mineral may have been in a metastable state, and the June 1st event may have been the moment when that metastability collapsed, and a phase change cascaded along a narrow zone, releasing seismic energy. But the model cannot uniquely identify which mineral, or whether transformation faulting is even the right mechanism. It is one candidate. We have to look at the other two. There is a piece of context worth adding to the metastable olivine story, because it gives you some sense of why the model is so attractive, and why, despite the difficulties at shallower depths, it has remained the leading explanation for at least the deepest deep focus earthquakes for the past 3.5 decades. Olivine, the dominant mineral in oceanic mantle, is one of the most carefully studied minerals in all of high-pressure mineralogy. Its phase relations are known. Its kinetic behavior under different temperature and pressure paths has been measured in dozens of separate laboratory programs. The conditions under which it transforms into wadsleyite, into ringwoodite, into perovskite structured polymorphs at lower mantle conditions are constrained to within narrow uncertainties. When you say that metastable olivine could persist in a cold slab to depths beyond the 410-kilometer transition, you are making a claim that can be tested against laboratory data, against thermodynamic calculations, against direct observations of slab structure in the deepest portions of the upper mantle. The tests, as it turns out, support the claim. There are clear seismic indications of metastable olivine wedges inside several of the world's coldest slabs. Studies of the Mariana Slab, of the Tonga-Kermadec system, of the Izubonin Trench have all produced evidence for narrow zones of seismically anomalous material at depths greater than the 410-kilometre transition. The anomalies are consistent with the presence of metastable olivine that has not yet transformed despite the surrounding rock having transformed at much shallower depths. The persistence of metastable olivine to depths of 500 or 600 kilometres in the coldest slabs is, at this point, well established. The Calabrian slab is smaller and less extensively studied than the Great Pacific slabs, but it is among the cold and steep slabs where, in principle, metastable olivine could persist to substantial depths. Whether the June 1st event involved metastable olivine specifically, or some other kinetically frozen high-pressure mineral, is something the careful spectral analysis of the rupture signal may or may not be able to determine. The seismic radiation patterns from transformation faulting are subtly different from the patterns from purely brittle fracture, particularly in the polarization of the high-frequency portion of the signal. The moment tensor inversion that the Harvard group and the USGS group are running on this event over the next few weeks will, with luck, give some hints. But here is the deeper point I want you to walk away with. Even if the mechanism for the June 1st event turns out to be something other than transformation faulting, even if it turns out to be dehydration, embrittlement, or thermal runaway, or some combination, the general principle that deep earthquakes require some kind of special mechanism, distinct from the conventional brittle fracture mechanism that operates at the surface, is established beyond reasonable doubt. The physics of the upper crust does not extend to the upper mantle. The behaviour of cold subducting slabs is not the behaviour of warm wet surface rock. The Earth, at depth, plays by different rules. Understanding those rules is the entire project of deep focus seismology. It is a slow project. It has taken 100 years to get to where we are. It will take more decades to finish. The Italian rupture of June 1st, 2026 is one moment in that long arc. It does not, by itself, resolve any of the open questions, but it sits inside the catalogue of evidence that future seismologists will use to resolve them, and that alone is a reason to take it seriously, to look at the data carefully, to understand what the depth and the location and the magnitude collectively mean. A short closing observation on the metastable olivine model that I want to add before moving on. The model was, in 1989 when Green and Burnley first proposed it, controversial. It departed from the conventional understanding of deep earthquakes in ways that many established seismologists at the time were skeptical of. The mechanism required a kind of mineral physical behaviour, a sudden phase change cascade driven by kinetic delay, that had not been previously documented in the context of seismic ruptures. The reception was, by the standards of academic geophysics, mixed. What changed was the laboratory work that followed. Over the next decade, Green and his collaborators, along with several other independent groups, ran experiments that reproduced the basic phenomenon in olivine analogues at appropriate pressures. They documented the sudden release of acoustic energy that accompanied the phase change. They mapped the morphology of the resulting fault zones in the recovered samples. They showed that the energy release and the rupture geometry were consistent with what was inferred for natural deep focus earthquakes. By the late 1990s, the mechanism was no longer controversial in the abstract. The remaining question was its scope. At what depths, in which slabs, under what conditions does it actually operate? That question, as we discussed earlier, is still partially open. The trajectory of the metastable olivine story is in some ways characteristic of how the deep focus problem has evolved. A mechanism is proposed. The mechanism is met with initial skepticism. Laboratory work either supports or refutes the mechanism. The mechanism's scope of applicability is debated. Over decades, a consensus emerges about which mechanism operates in which conditions. The deep focus problem is, in this sense, not a question waiting for a single grand answer. It is a question being addressed by a slowly accumulating set of partial answers, each of which applies in some restricted context. The Italian event of June 1st will, in the years ahead, be analysed for what it can tell us about which of these partial answers applies to its specific case. That analysis is one of the things that makes the event scientifically worth our attention. Part 8. Mechanism 2. When slabs release their water. The second candidate explanation for deep focus earthquakes was, in its earliest form, proposed in the 1960s. It has the appealing feature that it derives from a simple observation about subducting slabs and the water they carry with them. When oceanic lithosphere is created at a mid-ocean ridge, it is hot, dry, and stable. As the new seafloor cools and moves away from the ridge, it is continuously exposed to seawater. Water seeps into the upper portion of the lithosphere through cracks and faults, and at depths of a kilometre or two below the seafloor, it begins to react chemically with the rock. The most important reaction, for our purposes, is the formation of serpentinite. Serpentinite is the hydrated form of olivine. Water reacts with olivine in the cool, hydrated upper mantle to produce a family of minerals, antigorite, lizardite, chrysotile, collectively called serpentine, that bind water chemically into their crystal structures. Up to 13% of the weight of serpentinite is water, locked into the lattice as hydroxyl groups attached to the silicate framework. When you subduct hydrated oceanic lithosphere, you're not just subducting rock, you're subducting a substantial reservoir of chemically bound water. Estimates of the total flux of water entering the Earth's mantle via subduction range from about 300 to 1,000 teragrams per year, which is to say, several Mississippi rivers worth of water moving down into the mantle every year, globally, in chemical form. As the slab descends, it heats up. At some depth, depending on the slab's temperature profile, its dip and its speed, the temperature rises high enough that the serpentinite minerals are no longer thermodynamically stable. They decompose, releasing the water they had been carrying. The decomposition is called dehydration. The water released by dehydration is initially a supercritical fluid, neither liquid nor gas, with properties intermediate between the two, and it rises through the slab and into the overlying mantle wedge, where it lowers the melting point of the rock and drives the partial melting that feeds the volcanic arc at the surface. Etna gets its magma, ultimately, from water released by the descending Ionian slab. So does every other volcano on every other arc anywhere on Earth. Now here is the key insight, developed by Steve Kirby at the United States Geological Survey, building on earlier work by the British seismologist Hugh Hurd and by the Russian School of High-Pressure Mineralogy. When water is released from serpentinite at depth, it does not flow uniformly through the slab. The slab is essentially impermeable, solid rock, no continuous pore network. Water released at depth gets trapped, locally, near the dehydrating mineral, at pressures that can exceed the lithostatic confining pressure. The water builds up, the fluid pressure rises, and in any region where the fluid pressure rises to approach the confining pressure, something dramatic happens. The effective normal stress on any potential fault surface in that region drops to near zero. The clamp that was holding the fault shut is released. The fault becomes free to slip. This is the principle of dehydration embrittlement, and it is the heart of the second deep focus mechanism. The relevant idea is that confining pressure does not actually matter on its own. What matters is the effective stress, which is the difference between the confining pressure and the local pore fluid pressure. If the fluid pressure rises high enough, the effective stress falls to zero, and the rock behaves as if there were no confining pressure at all. A fault that has been frozen for millions of years under the lithostatic clamp can suddenly slip, releasing all the elastic strain that has been accumulating in the surrounding rock. That sudden slip radiates seismic energy. From the outside, you see what looks like a brittle earthquake. From the inside, the mechanism is a fluid pressure-driven failure on a pre-existing weakness inside the slab. Kirby, working with Eric Engdahl and Roger Denlinger, developed this model formally in a 1996 AGU monograph paper. They argued that essentially all intermediate depth earthquakes, events between about 70 and 300 kilometers depth, could be explained by dehydration embrittlement of subducting hydrous minerals. They showed how the depth ranges of intermediate seismicity in slabs around the world correlate with the predicted dehydration depths of various hydrous minerals, with antigorite serpentinite providing the dominant signal in the upper portion of the zone, and other minerals contributing at greater depths. The dehydration embrittlement model has several strengths. First, it explains why the depth range of intermediate earthquakes corresponds so well to the depth ranges where slab minerals are expected to dehydrate. Second, it explains why intermediate earthquakes are common in all subducting slabs that carry hydrous minerals, not just in the cold ones where metastable olivine might persist. Third, it provides a natural mechanism for the high stress drops that characterize deep focus events. The sudden release of fluid pressure can produce an effectively instantaneous unclamping of a previously frozen fault, and the rapid slip that follows can release stored elastic energy in a very concentrated burst. The depth of the Italian event, at 243 kilometers, sits within the upper portion of the depth range where antigorite serpentinite is expected to dehydrate. The Ionian slab carries hydrated oceanic lithosphere, originally formed at the mid-Atlantic ridge and other Tethyan spreading centers tens of millions of years ago. There is every reason to believe that some serpentinite is present in the descending slab at this depth, and that some of it has been progressively dehydrating as the slab heats up. If dehydration embrittlement is the relevant mechanism, the June 1st event was the failure of a fluid pressurized fault surface inside the slab, triggered by a local accumulation of water released from serpentinite somewhere upstream of the rupture point. The dehydration embrittlement model has its own difficulties. The principal one is that at depths greater than about 300 kilometers, the hydrous minerals that the model relies on are no longer expected to be present. Antigorite serpentinite has essentially fully dehydrated by 300 to 350 kilometers depth. The model can explain the upper portion of the deep seismic zone, but it struggles to explain the deepest events, the ones at 400, 500, 600 kilometers depth, where the laboratory says no hydrous minerals should still be carrying water. For those deepest events, you need a different mechanism, which is where the third candidate comes in. But for the Italian event specifically, at 243 kilometers, dehydration embrittlement is a perfectly viable candidate. The slab is cold enough, the depth is right, the relevant minerals are present, the mechanism predicts both the timing and the magnitude class of what we observed. The only thing we cannot do from the seismograms alone is distinguish definitively between this mechanism and the transformation faulting mechanism we discussed in the previous part. Both would produce a similar-looking seismic signal. Both would release similar amounts of energy. Both are consistent with the depth and tectonic setting. We need more data, possibly years of careful analysis, possibly never to be acquired direct measurements inside the slab, to know which one actually drove this rupture. A small note on the chemistry of slab water that might be useful before we move on. The water in serpentinite is not free liquid water. It is chemically bonded, incorporated into the silicate structure as hydroxyl groups attached to magnesium and iron atoms. When the rock heats up to the point that those bonds break, the water is released. But in the very high-pressure environment of the deep slab, the released water does not behave like ordinary water that you might encounter at the surface. It is a supercritical fluid, meaning it is past the critical point at which the distinction between liquid and gas disappears. Supercritical water at the pressures of the deep slab has unusual properties. It is much less dense than ordinary liquid water at standard conditions, but much more dense than ordinary water vapor. It dissolves silicate minerals to a much greater extent than ordinary water does. It is highly mobile, capable of penetrating tiny cracks and grain boundaries that ordinary fluids cannot reach. These properties matter because they shape how the dehydration embrittlement mechanism actually works in practice. The supercritical fluid released from a dehydrating serpentinite grain does not just sit there. It migrates along whatever paths the surrounding rock offers, accumulating in regions of slightly lower pressure, dissolving minerals as it goes, transporting silicate material in solution from one location to another. The detailed picture of how fluid pressure builds up in a specific location inside the slab is a complicated interplay between the rate of dehydration, the connectivity of the fluid pathways, the rheology of the surrounding rock, and the regional stress field. The simple picture I sketched earlier, fluid pressure rises, effective stress drops, fault unclamps, is the high-level story. The actual physics is messier and involves a lot of intermediate steps. One of the open questions in dehydration embrittlement research is how quickly the fluid pressure can rise in the relevant volumes. The mechanism only works as an earthquake driver if the fluid pressure can build up faster than the slab can drain it. If the slab is too permeable, the fluid leaks out gradually and never reaches the critical pressure needed to unclamp a fault. If the slab is essentially impermeable, the fluid builds up locally and produces the conditions for a sudden rupture. The actual permeability structure of the slab is hard to know directly, but the inference from the seismicity patterns is that some portions of cold slabs are sufficiently impermeable to allow fluid pressure to build up to the point where dehydration embrittlement can drive seismic ruptures. The Italian event of June 1st may have been one such case. Part 9. Mechanism. 3. Runaway thermal failure. The third candidate explanation for deep focus earthquakes is, in some ways, the most physically elegant, because it does not require any special mineralogy or any special fluid pressurization. It says only that the slab is rock, the rock is under stress, and once any small region of the rock begins to deform, the deformation itself generates heat, and the heat softens the rock, and the softening allows more deformation, and the cycle runs away into a self-sustained slip pulse. The mechanism is called thermal shear instability, or sometimes thermal runaway, and it was first proposed in detail for the deep focus problem by the Australian geophysicists Bruce Hobbs and Alison Ord in a 1988 paper in the Journal of Geophysical Research. The basic physics goes like this. Imagine a region of rock inside a slab under shear stress. The rock is in mechanical equilibrium. The applied stress is balanced by the rock's intrinsic resistance to deformation. Now imagine a small perturbation, perhaps a tiny inclusion of a slightly weaker material, or a microscopic crack that initiates some local shear or any other small departure from perfect uniformity. The shear in that small region releases a small amount of mechanical energy as heat. The local temperature rises slightly. The viscosity of the rock, its resistance to flow, depends very strongly on temperature. A small rise in temperature produces a substantial drop in viscosity. The lower viscosity allows the local shear to accelerate. The accelerated shear generates more heat. The temperature rises further, the viscosity drops further, the shear accelerates further. If the geometry of the slab and the rate of the applied stress are right, this positive feedback can run away into a self-sustained slip pulse, propagating through the rock at velocities that approach the speed of seismic waves. The slip pulse radiates seismic energy as it propagates, in a pattern that, from the outside, is indistinguishable from a brittle earthquake. But the underlying mechanism is not brittle fracture. It is a runaway thermal instability, a thermally amplified shear localization that converts a small local perturbation into a planet-relevant elastic energy release. Hobbs and Ord's original paper laid out the physics in general terms. The mechanism was elaborated further by Stefan Breck and Yuri Podlachikov, working at the University of Oslo, who in 2007 published a paper in Physical Review Letters showing that the runaway can occur in a wide range of geomaterials under appropriate conditions. They argued that thermal runaway was not just one mechanism among several for deep focus earthquakes. It was potentially the universal mechanism, capable of explaining events at any depth in any slab without requiring any specific mineralogical conditions. The strengths of the thermal shear instability model are real. First, it does not require any specific mineral assemblage or any specific fluid pressurization. It can, in principle, operate on any fault inside any slab, at any depth from a few tens of kilometers down to the bottom of the upper mantle. Second, it provides a natural explanation for the highest magnitude deep events, like the 1994 Bolivian MW 8.2 earthquake, where the energy release was too large to be plausibly explained by purely local phase transformations or fluid pressurization. The thermal mechanism, in principle, can scale up to arbitrarily large slip events as long as the geometry supports it. The weaknesses are also real. First, the laboratory evidence for thermal runaway in solid rock under the relevant pressures is harder to obtain than the laboratory evidence for transformation, faulting, or dehydration embrittlement. The experiments require sustained high-pressure shear at temperatures that are difficult to control and to measure precisely. Second, the theoretical predictions for when thermal runaway will occur depend sensitively on parameters: the strain rate sensitivity of the rock viscosity, the heat capacity, the thermal conductivity, that are not well constrained for mantle conditions. The model is internally coherent, but the quantitative predictions it makes are difficult to test against specific events. Third, the model does not naturally explain why deep focus earthquakes appear to cluster in specific depth ranges within slabs, as the transformation, faulting, and dehydration embrittlement models do. If thermal runaway can in principle operate at any depth, why do we see preferential clustering at the depths predicted by the other two mechanisms? The consensus answer, as of 2026, is that all three mechanisms probably operate in different proportions depending on the depth and the slab. Transformation faulting may dominate at the deepest events, where mineral phase changes are most plausible. dehydration embrittlement may dominate at intermediate depths, where hydrous minerals are still active. Thermal runaway may operate everywhere, providing the underlying physics that allows shear localization to occur regardless of the specific trigger. The three are not mutually exclusive, they are complementary. For the Italian event at 243 kilometers, any of the three could plausibly be the dominant mechanism. The depth is too shallow for the classical metastable olivine to apply, but it is within range for other phase transformations. The depth is right for late-stage antigorite dehydration. The depth is right for thermal runaway. Without much more detailed analysis of the rupture process, corner frequency analysis, source mechanism inversion, careful comparison with other events in the same slab, we cannot say which mechanism dominated. What we can say is that the event is consistent with the family of deep focus mechanisms, that it is one more data point in a 100-year-old puzzle, and that geophysicists at INGV, at Harvard, at USGS, and at the moment tensor groups will spend the next several months looking at the waveforms in detail to try to extract whatever information they can about what mechanism was operating. This is, I think, the heart of what makes this earthquake worth your attention. Not the damage, not the magnitude, not even the depth, taken on its own. What makes it worth your attention is that the Earth, in a place where the surface conditions look perfectly normal and where the news cycle moved on within an hour, just produced a clean, undisputed, globally recorded data point on one of the most important unresolved questions in solid Earth geophysics. The textbook says rock cannot break at that depth. The textbook is, in some sense we still do not fully understand, wrong. The Italy event is one more piece of evidence that whatever is actually happening inside cold subducting slabs is something we have not yet fully explained, and that, more than any other dimension of this story, is what is worth knowing. A small note on why thermal shear instability is sometimes called the most physically elegant of the three candidate mechanisms. The reason is that it does not require any specific conditions beyond what every subducting slab must have. Every slab is rock under stress. Every slab is at temperatures where the rock's viscosity has a strong temperature dependence. Every slab, in principle, can experience thermal runaway if the geometry of the stress and the rate of loading are right. The mechanism is general. The mechanism is universal. It does not depend on metastable olivine or on serpentinite or on any other particular mineral. It depends only on the physics of how stressed rock with a temperature-dependent viscosity behaves when small perturbations begin to localize. The challenge for the thermal runaway model has always been quantitative. The mechanism is physically plausible in principle, but predicting exactly when and where it will operate, in any specific slab, requires knowing the constitutive properties of the rock at the relevant pressures and temperatures to a precision that is hard to achieve in the laboratory. The strain rate sensitivity of olivine viscosity at 3 gigapascals and 400 degrees Celsius is, by laboratory standards, an extreme condition. The experiments take years to set up. The results carry significant uncertainty. The theoretical predictions, when you try to convert them into specific quantitative statements about when thermal runaway will produce an earthquake of a given magnitude in a given slab, depend sensitively on parameters that are not well constrained. Despite these difficulties, thermal runaway remains the most actively researched of the three mechanisms in the 2020s, partly because of its universality and partly because the laboratory and theoretical tools needed to test it have been steadily improving. The Italian event of June 1st will almost certainly become a comparison case for thermal runaway models in the coming years. Researchers will look at the rupture process, compare it to predictions from the thermal mechanism, and see whether the model fits or fails. If it fits, the model will gain another data point in its favour. If it fails, the model will need to be refined. Either way, the science moves forward. Part 10. The 1915 Ghost Event. Before we go further into what we can and cannot conclude about the June 1st earthquake, we need to spend a moment with its only real historical companion. Because the Calabrian Arc, despite being a globally significant deep focus province, has produced almost no events at this magnitude and depth class in the entire history of instrumental seismology. The Italian event of June 1st, 2026 is, essentially, only the second such event from this slab segment that we have on the record. The first was in 1915. The 1915 event is not extensively studied. It happened in an era when the instrumental network covering southern Italy was still primitive, and the depth and magnitude determinations from that period carry substantial uncertainty. The best modern catalogue reanalyses place the event at a depth somewhere between 200 and 300 kilometres, with a magnitude somewhere between 6.7 and 7.0 on the moment magnitude scale, and a location somewhere beneath the southern Tyrrhenian Sea, not far from the Calabrian coast. It was, by everything we can reconstruct, a slightly larger and at comparable depth version of the June 1st event. It would have been globally detectable, just as the June 1st event was, on the seismic stations then in operation. It would have been impulsive on the recordings. It would have been mechanically similar, sitting at the same point in the same descending Ionian slab. Between 1915 and 2026, a span of 111 years, the southern Tyrrhenian deep focus zone has produced essentially no other earthquakes of magnitude 6 or greater at depths greater than 200 kilometres. There have been smaller events at depth. There have been shallow earthquakes in the overlying crustal faults, the 1980 Irpinia, the 2002 Tyrrhenian crustal event, various others, but they are not part of the same seismicity. The deep zone, at this magnitude class, has been essentially quiet for a century. The June 1st event reopens it. What does that tell us? Honestly, not very much, with only 2 data points. You cannot compute a recurrence interval from 2 events. You cannot calculate the probability of another event in the next decade. You cannot say anything statistically meaningful about the typical pacing of large, deep ruptures in this slab. The southern Tyrrhenian segment is too small, the events are too rare, and the catalogue is too short. What we can say is that this is a real recurring phenomenon. The slab does produce events of this size, at this depth, occasionally, and that the recurrence interval is somewhere on the order of decades to centuries. We cannot say whether the next event will come tomorrow or in 200 years. The data is too sparse. Here is the honest framing. The June 1st event is rare. It is the second event of its kind that we have ever recorded. It tells us that the Calabrian deep zone is mechanically active at this magnitude class, which is something we already knew from the 1915 event, but which had not been confirmed in the modern era of high-resolution instrumentation. The June 1st event will be analysed much more carefully than the 1915 event could be, because we have an entire global broadband network rather than a sparse pre-war regional network. We will learn more from it than we could possibly have learned from the 1915 analogue, and eventually, perhaps in 50 years, perhaps in 150, there will be a third event, and we will be able to start building a real catalogue of southern Tyrrhenian deep focus seismicity. For now, we have 2 data points. 2 data points is enough to confirm that the phenomenon is real. It is not enough to predict anything about when the next one will come. A final small note on the historical context of the 1915 event, because it deserves slightly more discussion. The 1915 event in southern Italy was recorded on the relatively sparse pre-war Italian seismic network, supplemented by the few European observatories then in operation. The depth determination from that period is uncertain. The techniques available to the seismologists of the time did not allow them to pin down the focal depth as precisely as we can today. The published depth estimate for the 1915 event sits in a range from about 200 to 300 kilometres, with substantial uncertainty in either direction. The magnitude estimate similarly carries uncertainty, with modern catalogue reanalyses placing it somewhere between 6.7 and 7.0 on the moment magnitude scale, slightly larger than the June 1st event. What this means is that the 1915 event is, in a sense, partially hypothetical. We are confident that an event occurred. We are reasonably confident that it was deep, in the same depth range as the June 1st event. We are reasonably confident that it came from the Calabrian Arc subduction system. We cannot say with high precision what its source mechanism was, what its rupture process looked like, what its corner frequency was, or any of the other detailed source parameters that modern seismology can extract from modern events. The 1915 event is a historical analogue, but a fuzzy one. The June 1st event, by contrast, will be characterised in detail. The waveforms are clean, the global station coverage is comprehensive, the processing capabilities are modern. Within a few months, we will have firm constraints on the source mechanism, on the rupture velocity, on the stress drop, on the spatial extent of the rupture. We will have a much sharper picture of what happened than the seismologists of 1915 could have produced from their data. When the two events are eventually paired in some future paper on the Calabrian deep focus zone, the comparison will inevitably be asymmetric. The 1915 event will provide the long baseline historical anchor, confirmation that the zone has produced rare but recurrent events at this magnitude class. The June 1st event will provide the high-resolution modern reference, a detailed source characterization of what one of these events looks like when we can observe it with current instrumentation. Together, the two will define the deep focus catalogue of the southern Tyrrhenian, with a sample size of 2, separated by 111 years. The third event, when it comes, will add another data point. The fourth, eventually another. Slowly, over centuries, the catalogue will fill in. The events are too rare for the catalogue to ever be statistically robust on a human timescale. But they are not so rare that the catalogue will not eventually exist. The June 1st event is the second entry. That is, in its own quiet way, a significant moment. Most days, the planet is doing the same things it always does. The Earth rotates, the mantle convects, the plates move, the atmosphere flows. The vast majority of geophysical activity is routine, predictable, ongoing, and unspectacular. Once in a while, something happens that is rare enough to matter for understanding the planet at the deepest level. The June 1st event was one of those. The southern Tyrrhenian deep focus zone has been quiet at this magnitude class for 111 years. The zone just produced an entry, quiet on the surface, significant in the catalogue, worth knowing about. Part 11. What this isn't. The honest debunks. Before we close the scientific case, we have to spend a moment on what this earthquake is not. Because in the hours after a notable seismic event, particularly one that captures the public imagination because of its unusual location or its anomalous depth, a series of interpretive frameworks tend to attach themselves to the story. Most of those frameworks do not survive contact with the evidence. We are going to take them one by one. First framework: the claim that this earthquake is a precursor to a much larger shallow earthquake somewhere else in southern Italy. This claim attaches to almost every notable European earthquake, partly because southern Italy has a real and well-documented crustal seismic hazard, and partly because the human mind naturally wants to connect dots. The published seismological literature on the question of whether deep focus earthquakes can trigger or load shallow crustal earthquakes is unambiguous. The Coulomb stress transfer framework, established by Geoffrey King, Ross Stein and Jian Lin in a foundational 1994 paper, allows you to calculate exactly how much stress change a given earthquake produces on a given target fault. For an event at 243 kilometers depth, the calculated Coulomb stress change at any potential target fault in the southern Italian crust, at say 10 kilometers depth, is less than 0.1 bar. To put that number in perspective, the daily variation in atmospheric pressure at the surface produces a stress change of similar magnitude on shallow faults. The tides produce stress changes that are about an order of magnitude larger. The Coulomb stress change from this deep earthquake is small enough that it is essentially indistinguishable from background noise. What that means in practice is that a damaging shallow earthquake in Calabria, or Sicily, or anywhere else in southern Italy in the coming weeks, if one were to occur, cannot be confidently attributed to the deep event of June 1st. Southern Italy can produce a damaging crustal earthquake at any time, with or without a deep focus signal. The 1908 Messina disaster was a shallow crustal event, with no known deep focus precursor. The 1980 Irpinia disaster was a shallow crustal event with no known deep focus precursor. The 2009 L'Aquila earthquake had no known deep focus precursor. Crustal earthquakes happen on their own stress budgets, on faults that operate on timescales and mechanical conditions that are independent of what is happening 243 kilometers below them. The probability of a damaging shallow earthquake in southern Italy in any given month has not measurably changed because of the June 1st event. That probability was already there. It is still there. Second framework: the claim that this earthquake is somehow evidence for the expanding Earth hypothesis, the idea that the planet is physically growing in volume, that subduction does not actually occur, and that all earthquakes are produced by the expansion itself. This claim has a persistent online following, partly because it is visually simple, partly because the demonstration that the continents fit together on a smaller globe is genuinely striking the first time you see it. The expanding Earth hypothesis was originally proposed by the German engineer Ott Christoph Hilgenberg in 1933 with his book Vom wachsenden Erdball, and was developed in the modern era by the Australian geologist Samuel Warren Carey, particularly through his 1956 Tasmania Symposium and his 1976 book The Expanding Earth. We covered the expanding Earth question in detail on PNW just last week, in the context of the Antarctic Ridge Doublet, so I will not repeat the full debunk here. The short version is that NASA's 2011 satellite geodesy measurement of Earth's radius, using a combination of laser ranging, VLBI, GPS station displacements, and GRACE satellite data, concludes that the planet's radius is changing by less than 0.1 millimeters per year, which is statistically indistinguishable from zero. Direct observation of subduction at trenches around the world, paleomagnetic constraints on past Earth radius, the energy budget impossibility, and several other independent lines of evidence all converge on the same conclusion. The expanding Earth hypothesis is falsified. It does not survive the data. The Italian event of June 1st does not change any of this. It is a deep focus earthquake inside a subducting slab, a kind of event that the expanding Earth hypothesis has no mechanism to produce, and its existence is positive evidence for the conventional plate tectonics framework. The fact that the rupture occurred at a depth that requires a subducting cold slab to be present is exactly what subduction theory predicts and what expanding Earth theory cannot accommodate. The event is one more piece of evidence in favour of the standard model. Third framework, the HAARP and related ionospheric heating as earthquake trigger framework. This framework attributes every notable geophysical event to artificial atmospheric or ionospheric manipulation, typically by alleged secret programs operating at HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or its counterparts. For the Italian event, the energy budget alone is a complete refutation. HAARP's maximum continuous wave power as a transmitting facility is 3.6 megawatts. Over an hour of continuous operation, that delivers about 1.3 times 10 to the 10th joules of radio frequency energy into the upper atmosphere. The seismic energy released by the Italian MW 6.2 earthquake is approximately 6.3 times 10 to the 13th joules. The gap between the input and the output is more than 3 orders of magnitude, and that is before you account for the absence of any physical mechanism that would couple high-frequency radio waves to brittle failure inside a subducting slab at 243 kilometers depth. The radio waves do not penetrate that far. The radio waves do not interact with crystal lattices in any way that produces shear localization or fault rupture. The radio waves do not carry any momentum that could plausibly trigger seismic instability. The energy budget rules it out. The mechanism rules it out. Every previous deep focus earthquake throughout history rules it out, because they all happened before HAARP existed, on the same kinds of slabs producing the same kinds of events. The framework does not survive. Fourth framework, the claim that the global seismograph detection, the fact that stations in California, Alaska and Japan all picked up the impulsive pulse from this event, is itself anomalous, or evidence of something larger happening planet-wide. We covered this in part 3. Every earthquake of magnitude 6 or greater anywhere on Earth is recorded by every operational broadband seismograph globally. The detection is the baseline. The deep focus impulsive pulse is the expected signature of an event at this depth. There is no anomaly in the global detection pattern. The signature on the seismograms is exactly what the physics predicts for a clean deep focus rupture. People who present the global detection as if it were unusual are either unfamiliar with how the global seismic network functions, or are presenting selected evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. The detection pattern is unremarkable. It is what we would expect. Fifth framework, the claim that the deep earthquake will propagate stress upward through the slab and trigger volcanic eruptions on Etna, Stromboli or Volcano. This is more interesting because there is some scientifically defensible substrate to it. The slab and the volcanoes are mechanically coupled, and changes deep in the slab can in principle affect the magma supply or the pressure regime at the surface volcanoes. But the operational signature has to be very specific. The published research on slab volcano coupling shows that changes can propagate, but they typically do so over timescales of months to years, and the magnitude of the deep events that have been documented as influencing surface volcanism has typically been in the magnitude 7 to 8 range, not the magnitude 6 range. The June 1st event is too small to be a confident driver of surface volcanic change. If Etna does change its eruptive behavior in the next several months, the attribution to the June 1st event will be speculative at best. The volcanic system has its own dynamics, and the surface activity at Etna in 2026 is already a story being written by surface and shallow mantle processes independent of deep slab seismicity. That covers the 5 main interpretive frameworks that are attaching to this event. None of them survives the evidence as a strong claim. Some of them have partial scientific substrate that gets overstated, some of them are simply wrong. The honest framing is that the June 1st event is a rare, scientifically interesting deep focus rupture inside the Ionian slab, with no measurable implications for crustal hazard, no support for any alternative tectonic framework, no role for ionospheric manipulation, and no near-term predictive value for surface volcanic activity. It is what it is, a clean piece of mantle-scale seismology, worth understanding on its own terms, not as a vector for other interpretations. A small additional point about the conspiracy frameworks I covered in the previous part. The thing that tends to characterize these interpretive frameworks is that they treat every notable event as evidence for their preferred conclusion. A deep earthquake under Italy is, depending on which framework you ask, evidence for ionospheric weapons, for the expanding Earth, for an imminent crustal mega event, for a coordinated planetary signal. The same event miraculously is presented as confirming all of these mutually incompatible claims. The way to evaluate these claims is not to engage with them individually on their merits. The merits are usually absent. The way is to ask the question that no conspiracy framework can answer well. What would falsify your claim? What evidence, if you saw it, would convince you that your interpretation was wrong? Conventional seismology has a straightforward answer to this question. If the global seismic network suddenly started failing to detect deep earthquakes that were clearly visible in regional data, that would falsify the global network's reliability. If laboratory experiments on metastable olivine, on hydrous mineral dehydration, on thermal runaway and slab-relevant materials all failed to reproduce the seismic signatures of deep events that would falsify the candidate mechanisms. If a deep focus earthquake were observed in a setting where no cold subducting slab is present, that would falsify the slab mechanism framework entirely. Each of these tests is in principle observable. None of them has produced contradicting evidence so far. The model survives because the data keeps fitting. The expanding Earth hypothesis, by contrast, was falsified decades ago by satellite geodesy. The HARP framework is falsified by the energy budget at every event. The crustal precursor claim is falsified by the historical record of Italian crustal earthquakes that occurred without deep precursors. The global seismograph signature anomaly claim is falsified by the routine global detection of every magnitude 6 event in human history. Each of these frameworks fails its own falsification test. The reason they persist is not that they are scientifically robust. It is that they offer narrative frames that the existing scientific picture cannot fully replace. The puzzle of why a deep earthquake happens at all, the genuine, unresolved scientific mystery at the heart of this video, is itself dramatic enough that you do not need any of the conspiracy frames to feel the gravity of what just happened. The science is sufficient. The science is, in fact, more interesting than any of the alternative frames. Part 12. The 3 readings. Routine, slab activation, crustal precursor. Here is a useful framework for thinking about what the Italian event of June 1st means going forward. There are essentially 3 coherent ways to read it, ranging from the most conservative to the most speculative, and the honest position is that the most conservative reading is the most defensible, while the middle reading is worth keeping in mind as a watch-and-see frame. Reading 1. The routine interpretation. A magnitude 6.2 at 243 kilometers in the Calabrian Arc is unusual, but it is not unprecedented. The 1915 event provides a single analogue at comparable magnitude and depth. The deep focus seismology problem is well understood at the general level. Something inside the cold slab failed, in the manner that deep focus earthquakes always fail, through some combination of phase transformation, dehydration, and thermal instability, even if the specific physics of this specific event is unresolved. The rupture released stress inside the slab. The stress release was internal to the slab. It does not load the overlying crustal faults in any measurable way. It does not predict surface activity. It is a clean piece of mantle-scale seismology. If you adopt the routine reading, The operational consequence is simple. Nothing changes. Italy's crustal hazard remains what it has been for centuries. The volcanoes continue to behave according to their own internal dynamics. The Ionian slab continues to descend, occasionally producing deep focus events at the rate of approximately 1 per century at this magnitude class. The Italian event of June first becomes a high-quality data point in a sparse catalogue, important for scientific understanding of deep focus mechanisms but not predictive of anything dramatic in the short term. This is the most defensible interpretation given the evidence in front of us. Reading 2. The slab activation interpretation. A subducting slab is not a static object. It is being pulled down by its own weight, the force called slab pull, at a rate that varies over time. It is being bent and twisted by the geometry of its descent. It is being heated unevenly. It is interacting with the surrounding mantle in ways that produce ongoing stress evolution. A large deep focus rupture may be the visible manifestation of a phase of accelerated deformation inside the slab, a slab activation episode in which the slab is reorganizing internally in some way that we cannot directly observe, but whose effects we may see expressed in additional deep events in the coming months to years, in changes to the eruptive behavior of the surface volcanoes that depend on the slab for their magma supply, in subtle changes to the deformation field that GPS measurements across southern Italy might pick up. If you adopt this reading, the operational consequence is that you watch the slab over the next 12 to 24 months. You watch for additional deep events at similar depths. You watch for changes at Etna, at Stromboli, at Vulcano. You watch for changes in the GPS data from southern Italy. You watch for anything else that might indicate that the slab is doing something more than ordinary background descent. This reading is speculative. It is not strongly supported by the single event, and most large, deep focus events historically have not been followed by anomalous slab behavior. But it is the kind of frame that is worth keeping in your back pocket for the next year or two as additional data comes in. Reading 3. The crustal precursor interpretation. This is the reading that says the deep event signals a stress reorganization that will load the overlying crustal faults, and that a damaging shallow earthquake is now more likely in southern Italy than it was 24 hours before the deep rupture. This reading does not survive the seismological literature. The Coulomb stress changes at the surface from a 243-kilometre event are too small to be measurable. The historical pattern of crustal seismicity in Italy shows no correlation with deep focus events. The deep events and the shallow events live in different mechanical worlds. The probability of a damaging crustal earthquake in southern Italy is essentially unchanged from what it was the day before. So the centered reading is reading 1. The watch and see reading is reading 2. The reading that does not survive the evidence is reading 3. If you take only one frame away from this video, take the first. If you want to be slightly more attentive than the data strictly demands, also hold the second in your mind. Do not take the third. The third gets repeated more loudly than the first or the second in many online corners, but it is the one that the evidence simply does not support. One more framing dimension is worth mentioning before we close because it gets us back to the central thread of why this earthquake matters at all. None of the 3 readings above is about the depth itself. They are all about what the event implies for the future. But the most interesting thing about the June 1st event is not what it implies. It is what it confirms about the present. It confirms that the conventional, textbook, 100-year-old understanding of how rock breaks is incomplete. It confirms that something is happening inside cold subducting slabs that the brittle failure model does not capture. It confirms that the 3 candidate mechanisms, transformation faulting, dehydration embrittlement, thermal runaway, are not just academic exercises, but are the only available explanations for events that demonstrably occur. The Italy event does not predict any future event, but it does sharpen the present puzzle. And the present puzzle is one of the most important unresolved problems in solid Earth geophysics. One more dimension of the 3 readings that I want to put on the table before we close. If you start with reading 1, the routine interpretation, and you take it seriously, you arrive at a fact about the Italian event that is, in its own way, more important than any of the readings about future hazard. The fact is that the event is, by the standards of deep focus seismology, a clean, isolated, scientifically tractable data point. It is small enough to be unambiguously characterized. It is in a region where the surrounding tectonic context is well understood. It is at a depth where the candidate mechanisms can be sharply tested. It is on a slab whose three-dimensional geometry has been mapped in detail by tomography over the past several decades. What that means in practice is that the June 1st event will become one of the better-studied deep-focus earthquakes of the past several years. Not because of its magnitude — there are many larger deep events globally — but because of its setting. The combination of the depth, the slab, the cleanness of the rupture, and the high-quality global station coverage means that this event will probably yield more about the mechanism of deep-focus earthquakes than several comparable events in less well-studied regions. The Tonga-Fiji deep events are larger but happen in a region where the slab is structurally more complicated. The Hindu Kush events are at similar depths but happen in a tectonically more complex setting. The Bucaramanga Nest beneath Colombia produces many events but at smaller magnitudes. The Italian event has the unusual combination of being in a tractable setting, at a useful magnitude, and in a region where the surrounding context is already well characterized. It is, scientifically, a gift. The careful analysis of the rupture process over the next few months to years will produce results. Those results will probably not fully resolve the deep focus problem, but they will move us forward by some small increment. They will probably help discriminate between the candidate mechanisms in this specific event. They will probably contribute to the broader, slow accumulation of evidence about which mechanism dominates in which slab at which depth. The Italian event, in other words, is going to make us slightly smarter about how the Earth works. That is what deep focus events do. They are letters from the inside of the planet, written in elastic waves, decoded by the global broadband network, slowly accumulating into a picture of an environment that we cannot otherwise see. The three readings I have laid out are about what the event implies for the future. The fact that the event is going to advance our understanding of the deep mantle is about what the event implies for our knowledge. The two are related, but they are separable. You can hold the routine reading on the future and still recognize that the event is scientifically consequential. You can think that nothing will follow from it operationally in the next year, and still recognize that something will follow from it intellectually in the next several years. The Italy event is interesting precisely because the operational stakes are low and the scientific stakes are not. Part 13. An unfinished problem. We are going to close with a question. Not a tidy answer, a question. Why does rock break at depths where rock should not be able to break? A century after Wadati first mapped the inclined zone of deep seismicity beneath Japan, 80 years after Benioff generalized the observation to every subduction zone on Earth, 40 years after Green and Burnley laid out the metastable olivine mechanism, 30 years after Kirby formalized the dehydration embrittlement framework, 20 years after Froelich published the standard reference on deep earthquakes, we still cannot answer the question. We have three candidate mechanisms, all of them physically plausible, all of them with some laboratory support, and all of them with depth ranges and slab conditions where they should work. We can show you the candidate physics, we can show you the laboratory experiments, we can show you the slab tomography, we can show you the rupture signatures. We cannot tell you which mechanism actually drove any specific event, including the one that happened beneath Italy on the night of June 1st, 2026. That event was, by every operational measure, unremarkable. Magnitude 6.2. No deaths, no damage, no tsunami, no structural failures, no emergency response. By the next morning, the news cycle had moved on. By the next week, it will be remembered, if at all, as a brief footnote in a busy month of European weather and routine European seismicity. But by the metrics that matter to the longer-term project of understanding the planet we live on, that event was something else. It was a quietly delivered piece of data on a 100-year-old problem that almost nobody outside seismology knows is even open. Italy gave us, in those few seconds of mantle-deep rupture, a new high-quality recording of the kind of event that the textbook says cannot happen, but that the textbook also has no real explanation for. That recording will be analysed for years. It will become a citation in future papers on transformation faulting, on dehydration embrittlement, on thermal runaway. It will become a comparison case for the next event in the Calabrian Arc, whenever that comes. It will become one more data point in a catalogue whose total membership is small enough to count on your hands. And that is the thing I want you to take away. The dramatic stories that get the headlines, the eruptions, the floods, the heat domes, the storms, are real and they matter. We cover them on this channel, because they are part of the live signal that the Earth is sending out and that we are obligated to listen to. But there is another kind of signal, quieter and more abstract, that we are also receiving from the planet all the time, and that signal is what tells us about parts of the Earth that no instrument has ever directly visited. The deep mantle, the descending slabs, the hot uppermost lower mantle, the cold cores of the deepest oceanic plates. These are regions of our planet that we cannot drill into. We cannot send probes there. We will, in any realistic projection of the next several centuries, never put a human eye or a human-built sensor in any of them. The only way we have of knowing what is happening inside them is to read the signals they send out in the form of earthquakes and the seismic waves the earthquakes generate. Every deep focus earthquake is a letter from the inside of the planet. The Italian event was a letter. We have not finished reading it. When the next one comes, and it will come, whether next year or next century, we will have somewhat better tools to read it with. The global broadband network will be denser. The processing algorithms will be more refined. The laboratory data on relevant mineral behavior will be more comprehensive. The theoretical models will be more developed. We may, by the time the next Calabrian deep event arrives, be able to say definitively which mechanism is operating. Or we may still be in the position we are in now, with 3 candidates and no clear winner. Either way, the question that the Italy event of June 1st poses will still be the question that anybody curious about how the Earth works has to engage with. How does rock break at depths where rock should not be able to break? The honest answer in 2026 is that we do not yet know. But we are listening. The slabs are talking. Italy spoke last night. Somewhere, right now, in a slab beneath Tonga, or beneath the Marianas, or beneath South America, the next deep event is being assembled, in the slow accumulation of strain and the slow descent of cold lithosphere into the hot mantle. When it arrives, it will join the catalogue. When it joins the catalogue, it will help us answer the question. One letter at a time, one rupture at a time, one signal at a time, from depths we cannot otherwise see. And that, however quiet, however undramatic, however buried beneath the larger stories of the week, is what just happened beneath Italy. The slab spoke, the planet whispered, and the textbook is still wrong. Good night. I want to close with one specific thought, because I think it is the thought that makes the whole story click into place. The Earth is layered, from the crust where you live, down through the upper mantle, the transition zone, the lower mantle, the outer core, the inner core. The planet is divided into shells with very different physical properties. Each shell has its own chemistry, its own mineralogy, its own mechanical behavior. The crust is brittle and cool. The upper mantle is plastic and warm. The transition zone is a complicated layer of phase changes and density discontinuities. The lower mantle is hot and rigid in a way that the upper mantle is not. The outer core is liquid metal. The inner core is solid metal under impossible pressure. Each layer plays by different rules. Almost everything we know about the deeper layers, almost everything, comes from seismic waves. Earthquakes produce them. Seismic stations record them. The waves travel through the layered Earth, refract at the boundaries, reflect at the discontinuities, change speed and shape and frequency in ways that depend on what they are passing through. By analysing those changes, we can infer the structure of the layers without ever directly visiting them. The MOHO, the 410-kilometre discontinuity, the 660, the D double prime layer at the base of the mantle, the inner core boundary, all of these features were discovered, characterised, and named by reading seismic waves. Every earthquake in this sense is doing 2 jobs at once. It is the thing being studied, the rupture event we want to understand for its own sake, and it is also the probe, the tool, the signal that illuminates the rest of the Earth between the rupture and the receiving station. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake in southern Italy, at 243 kilometres depth, produces seismic waves that travel through the upper mantle, through the transition zone, possibly through the lower mantle if the path is right, and emerge at the surface in California, in Alaska, in Japan. The shape of the waves when they arrive tells us something about everything along the path. The same event that is the puzzle is also the tool with which we solve the puzzle. What I want you to take from this is that the Earth is a self-illuminating object. It is constantly sending out signals from its interior, in the form of earthquakes, and we are constantly receiving those signals on the global seismograph network. Every signal carries information about the rupture that produced it, about the path through which it travelled, and about the structure of the planet at the receiving end. The information is rich. The information is constantly accumulating. The information is, in a real sense, the only window we have onto the interior of the planet we live on. Italy, on the 1st of June, sent out a particularly clean signal, from a place that almost nobody outside seismology pays attention to, from a depth that almost nobody outside specialty geophysics knows is even possible, about a mechanism that almost nobody outside the field knows is still unsolved. We are still reading that letter. The reading will take a long time. The next letter is probably already on its way from somewhere else in the world. Eventually, taken together, the letters will give us the answer. Until then, listen. The planet is talking. The signals are clean. The story is real. The textbook is still wrong. And the deep, slow, century-old project of understanding why is, on every quiet night when another deep focus rupture happens in another quiet corner of the world, taking one more small step forward. Good night from Project Nightwatch.